broadcasting from the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and airing on WCPT 820, Chicago's progressive talk, where facts matter. Still, welcome to the Gailey Show, the only daily LGBTQ radio news and talk show in the United States. I'm your host, John Parker. It is Friday, so let's talk culture and entertainment. Better yet, let's talk about novels and memoirs. What is on the show today? In the second half hour, author Lance Garland's debut memoir, Out There, Dispatches from My Personal Wilderness, drops on October 7th, and we'll be talking with him about all of it and how you can pre-order your copy. But up first, he's the author of Yes, Daddy, and co-creator of the off-Broadway musical The Big Gay Jamboree, for which he received a Drama Desk nomination for Outstanding Book for a Musical just a few months ago. His newest novel is Not the End of the World, just came out earlier this summer. Jonathan Parks-Ramage, welcome to the Gailey Show.
Oh my God, thank you. It is my extreme pleasure to be here.
Oh, extreme pleasure. That's great. Speaking of extremes, let's start with the synopsis of your novel. So briefly, I'll say, before I ask you my first question, it's 2044. Life is pretty bleak for Americans, but there's wealthy Mason Daunt and his husband who can remain blissfully unaware of the relentless wildfires engulfing California, the proliferation of violent right-wing militias, and rampant authoritarianism destroying American society. But they are so rich, they're throwing a 100-person, $100,000 baby shower to celebrate their newborn on the way. But when a potentially apocalyptic event hits Los Angeles on the day of their celebration, they refuse to cancel their party because surely it's not the end of the world. Jonathan, if I did my research correctly, this novel started for you during the pandemic, and you were taking walks around your neighborhood just to get out of the house. But then there was a fire that swept through. Because of the smoke, you couldn't take those walks. And I've also read that you don't see this as a traditional dystopian novel in the sense of like an apocalyptic event, like zombies or a nuclear bomb, but rather what you see as a logical extension of the trajectory America is currently on. Let's start there about the logical extension and how you see your novel in 2044 kind of being the end game, if you will, of where we're at right now.
Yes. I wanted to create almost kind of like an anti-dystopia. I feel like so often dystopias, many fantastic works of literature, film, TV, that have depicted dystopia. I've depicted dystopia as this kind of thing that happens after some crazy world-altering event. But for me, I wanted to create a dystopia that felt very grounded and felt like a very realistic projection of where we could be based on where we are right now. And I think for me, as you mentioned, this novel is kind of born out of my own anxieties about our present moment. And I think one way that I've found to deal with anxiety is to face it head on versus trying to pretend like it's not happening. And so I think for me, this novel was a way of confronting all my anxieties about where we could be, and kind of projecting myself into a future that felt potentially realistic. And then kind of my guiding question throughout all of the writing of this was, how do we find hope in that realistic near future dystopia? How do we find hope within that? Because, as I'm sure you and many of the listeners feel out there tonight or today, it can be a hard thing to try to find hope in our modern moment.
One of those things that you have plot points in the novel or background of Mason's husband or partner is that he was basically hauled before the House Un-American Speech Committee, which I'm like, we're basically two steps away from there.
Yes. I wanted to create, already you're seeing all sorts of censorship, or if not censorship, consequences for people speaking out. Obviously, Trump taking, a hold of various media conglomerates and basically suing them into submission. So speech there, it's starting to get frosty, and there are starting to be consequences for speaking freely. But I kind of wanted to project, a future that, is basically modeled on, obviously, McCarthyism and the McCarthy era, in terms of, creating this government entity whose job it is to find, quote unquote, anti-American artists and activists and thinkers, and basically put them on trial and punish them for speaking out against authoritarianism. And, one rule I kind of kept throughout was, this is like a Margaret Atwood rule that I'm going to absolutely paraphrase, but essentially, when she was working on her own dystopian fiction, and I believe this was specifically about The Handmaid's Tale, she never depicted an event that hadn't already happened in history. Obviously, she put her own spin on it, but there is this sense that history does, in fact, repeat itself, as we've seen time and time again. So again, in all of these projections, I also looked towards world history, American history, and said, what in our past feels like it is most likely going to be repeated again? And that era of McCarthyism feels right now imminent, at least to me. And so the question is how to be an artist in that time. And the character you mentioned, yes, faces hefty legal fines that nearly destroy his life as a result of his quote unquote seditious material that protests the current authoritarian regime in America in the novel.
We are talking with author Jonathan Parks-Ramage about his new novel, It's Not the End of the World. I treasure the novel, Mrs. Dalloway. And here you take her / Mason on the worst possible day of planning a party. Talk about doing that to Mrs. Dalloway and to Mason. And I was listening to an interview where you were referencing hyper-normalization of this idea of trying to keep it normal while you're living through horrific social change, which Mason is taking to the nth degree. So talk about Mason's day.
Yes. I mean, Mrs. Dalloway, and it is referenced in the novel. I think there is just something, because the first chunk of the novel takes place kind of all within like this stretch of time where Mason is going about errands leading up to this baby shower. And so he has this kind of like wistful Dallowayan moment at the start where he just reflects on how he loves like kind of doing all these errands, preparing for the baby shower. He's quickly thrust into an apocalyptic event. But I do feel like there is something about, an event like a baby shower or like, the party Mrs. Dalloway is preparing for. It provides a backdrop, particularly with baby showers, a backdrop where the whole point of a baby shower is to project yourself into the future. As a parent, you're saying, I'm throwing this shower for my child, but also for the idea of my future child. And this, party for Mason, the protagonist, kind of ends up symbolizing, his hopes for the future, his hopes for this child. And it's kind of his willful, he willfully kind of pushes away certain realities and just hopes that his privilege will be enough to protect him from all of the kind of horrific forces that are in the ether at at the moment in 2044 that this takes place. But I think that, there's something about preparing for a party and the hope for the future, and also the reflection on the past. It's kind of this, it feels hefty with like symbolic weight, I think, for so many people. And so I felt like that was a kind of a perfect also backdrop to, juxtapose that with the apocalypse, the future coming in loud and fast and violent and brutal. And yet Mason still persists and still is convinced that he will be able to avoid the horrific fate that starts meeting so many other people in his city as he runs these errands. So I think it's also, an opportunity to kind of, like you're saying, also like examine the mundane kind of daily like tasks within this horrific future. And there's also, I think, a lot of room for satire there as well, in terms of Mason's willful kind of obliviousness to everything going on around him.
And they're not messing around with this baby shower, spending $100,000, including making sure that it's going to be nice and sunny.
Yes.
On the day.
Yes. There's like a climate engineering in this future. There's a climate engineering company called WeatherMod, which is able to dispel smoke essentially from your property during wildfires, so that people in wildfire engulfed California who are very wealthy can afford to have the smoke cleared and have their party in sunshine while the rest of California suffers.
All right. I have to fit in a very quick break here. We are talking with author Jonathan Parks-Ramage about his novel, It's Not the End of the World. We're going to have more with him after this break. Connect with more progressive news and radio at am950radio.com and heartlandsignal.com. You can continue the conversation on Blue Sky. We are at thegaleyshow.org on Blue Sky. You're listening to The Gailey Show on AM950 KTNF and WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I'm John Parker. We are coming up on the bottom of the hour. I'm here with author Jonathan Parks-Ramage. We're talking about his newest novel, It's Not the End of the World. Jonathan, part of the novel also includes the idea of surrogacy, right? Obviously, because Mason and his partner are, surrogates are using surrogacy as part of their childhood. And I was just kind of curious. I wanted to ask you about, when you were writing the novel, what were the questions and themes that you wanted to ask and explore as it relates to surrogacy? Because I've read in other articles and whatnot of ideas of maybe we need a more surrogacy throughout, like have a surrogacy pro. What is the word I'm looking for here? I'm blanking on the name of it. But talk to us about surrogacy and how you described it in the novel.
Yes. I mean, I think when queer people are having children, there is so much more intentionality that inevitably just has to be involved. You really have to think about how you're going to go about this, because it's not going to match the traditional kind of heterosexual scripts that surround obviously childbirth. And so I want the idea of surrogacy. I mean, I'm kind of two minds about it. Again, I'm always empathetic to any queer people who are trying to have children in any way. But I do think that within surrogacy there is, it is so expensive, and it is I think in the novel, at least, the question comes up, who is able to afford having children, and why are they able to, afford having children? And there is sometimes judgment that is reserved for poor people who choose to have children. Well, why would you have children if you couldn't afford them? Well, why shouldn't anyone on earth who wants to have children be allowed to have children? And it also, I think, there's this idea that you shouldn't have children unless you're able to afford to care for them. But why is care something that needs to be purchased at a very high cost? Why can't our governments, our communities, why can't we subsidize the care for all people, and release that pressure off of the individual, off of the private family unit, to be able to afford care for other individuals? So I don't know. There's a lot that I'm thinking about there, and I think what emerges in the novel, in this kind of realm is, and I won't give too much away, but there is, a shift that occurs that causes everyone to kind of think very differently about what a care unit could look like for a child, how we could structure things differently so that we were better able to care for all children and for ourselves, that having children isn't a privilege reserved increasingly for the wealthy, which it can often feel like, even today. I think as income inequality, increases, there is a real gap also in who's able to care for children. And so again, without giving too much away, I think you see in the kind of second half of the novel, radical experiments in how to structure care units, how to create new ideas of family that are hopefully more equitable and allow everyone to thrive.
I know I'm trying to be mindful here of like asking questions that don't give away plot points, but I do want to, you're talking about radical, and I do, with less than 4 minutes, want to bring up a huge topic of anarchism, and not that MAGA nonsense of films, but more anarchism in the tradition of like my favorite novel of all time, Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed, which I feel is the best novelization of anarchism. That's my humble opinion about it. But it does show up in your novel as an organizing structure of humans, how humans are deciding to organize themselves. And I am curious, like during the writing process, why did you go in that direction as opposed to the more traditional, or maybe not more traditional, just what we see more of, which is that sort of quasi-totalitarian council a la Matrix or The Last of Us?
Yeah, I mean, I was like searching for hope while writing this book. And the more I researched, the more I found hope in anarchism, and not this, again, the kind of stereotypical idea, which is not really what anarchism is, of like, yeah, anarchism just means like crazy, blow everything up, no rules. In the traditional sense of the world, whether you're looking at like, a European tradition of anarchism, or you're looking at Black radical anarchist traditions, there's actually so much organization. And it's really more about creating non-hierarchical communities where there is true direct democracy, where each person has an equal amount of power in say in how things are run, versus hierarchical representative democracy. So there's kind of lateral power structures, much more localized, much smaller, and much more focused on mutual aid and community. I just found so much hope looking back into these traditions, because I feel so hopeless today. And it was actually very comforting to look back in history and say, oh, people have always felt like the world is ending and have always been radical traditions, who've resisted the state, who have resisted oppressive, power structures, who have resisted fascism and authoritarianism. It has always felt like the end of the world to some group of people. And so to really look back and to do research, I found incredibly hopeful. And once again, in kind of that idea of like how history repeats itself, I said, well, how could these anarchist traditions, kind of reform in the future, and what might that look like?
Well, you all need to read this novel because it is going to affirm a lot of things that you may be feeling, and it is going to be very provocative, rather, and get you thinking. Obviously, you can tell from this interview. So we are including a link in our show notes and on our website for you to buy your copy right now. Jonathan, thank you for joining us today on The Gailey Show.
Thank you so much for having me. A true joy.
Please, anytime that you've got new work coming out, stop by. I will gladly talk to you about it and promote it. Jonathan's website is jonathan-p-r.com. Also on Instagram, he is at jp-ramage. All right, we are going to take a quick break here. None of this is possible without our generous advertisers and sponsors. So listen to who they are in the break, thank them, and tell them you heard about them on The Gailey Show on AM 950 KTNF and WCPT 820. Coming to you from the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and airing on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk. Welcome back to The Gailey Show, the only daily LGBTQ progressive radio news and talk show in America. I am your host, John Parker. We are 33 minutes after the hour. Continuing our New Book Friday episode, author Lance Garland's debut memoir, Out There, Dispatches from My Personal Wilderness, drops on October 7th. Lance spends his days fighting fire in Seattle, climbing the mountains of the Pacific Northwest, and sailing the Salish Sea? Salish Sea. You can tell I haven't been there yet. He's written for Outside, Travel and Leisure, Backpacker, Orion, Climbing, among others. Awarded the 2024 Pathfinder Prize and an American Alpine Club Catalyst Grant for uncovering, folks, the first queer climbing team in history. He's also received a fellowship at the Banff Center's Mountain Writing Residency and has been listed as the best American journalism and best backpacker stories of all time. Hello, Lance. Welcome to The Gailey Show.
Hi, John. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, where do we start? Okay, maybe at the beginning. So here's where I would like to start, because you come from a fundamentalist family, and you went in a different direction than I did, but I also come from a very fundamentalist family. So at 19, you were working pretty hard to qualify for Navy SEAL training. Maybe we can start there. Because that's sort of, I mean, for me, this is when you're like going out, you're getting out there.
Yeah, and this is the first chapter of the memoir. I was 19. I had already enlisted before I graduated from high school. And my goal was to be a SEAL. So I signed up for the SEAL Challenge, which meant that I got to have the opportunity to pass all the tests in order to qualify to get there. Didn't mean you were guaranteed to get there. You still had to pass all the tests, and luckily I did. So at 19, I got to show up to San Diego, California after boot camp and after some extra training in the Navy. And then I got to go and try my luck at becoming a SEAL. So that's the first two chapters of the book, setting out on my own and trying to figure out what kind of life I wanted to live.
So as folks can tell, Out There works on multiple levels. It's not just going out into the wilderness or going out onto a warship. But so what I want to ask for you to share with our listeners is, while you were going through this training, how did you understand yourself as a queer person, or how you were navigating your own sexuality during this time?
Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting time period because I was on my own for the first time and out of the, environment of that fundamentalist religion. And so I got to, look at my life from a different perspective.
Hmm.
And so while I was trying to become a Navy SEAL, I was also coming to terms with my sexuality and understanding myself as a gay man and asking myself, can me as a gay man be a Navy SEAL, and what will my life look like, and can I be, or should I be in the closet, and how should this work? And so while I'm asking myself all those questions, I'm doing some of the most intense training on the planet, and in
Hmm.
a community of people who are very driven, very intense, and have very strong perspectives. And so, it's a very weird place to come to terms with my sexuality. And I thought, by getting out of the house and getting away from that fundamentalist religion, that I would have more space to breathe. And then that took me into a whole new realm of being gay in the military, which was its own sort
Hmm.
of, oppressive structure. And so that's where the memoir continues on to, is what was my experience like, in the military as a gay man, first not out, and then as an out gay man in the Navy. That was a very wild experience during Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
So I want to ask about that, but before, so I remember, and I'm dating myself here. So this was 99. I just graduated from high school, and the recruiter calls, and I'm like, no, I'm good. He's like, why? I'm like, well, I'm gay. And he's like, well, you don't have to tell me that. You can still come in. And I was like, I'm telling you to end this conversation. And so, but where I'm going with that is that you're saying you're out of the house, and now you have an opportunity to do this, and you're entering an institution where everybody knows the military is don't ask, don't tell. So how are you thinking about that in terms of, like, did you see that as oppressive? Did you see that as, well, I can still be who I am and explore that as long as I just don't disclose that to the military? Like, how is your 19-year-old brain sort of processing wanting to explore who you are within this new framework of don't ask, don't tell?
That is such a good question. And for me, there was no intention. I hadn't pre planned. I was a 19-year-old naive kid. And I remember, this didn't make it into the memoir, but I remember being in boot camp, and there was a moment where they tell everybody, hey, there's this law of don't ask, don't tell. If you're gay, you need to leave, or, sign this paper saying you'll abide by the law of don't ask, don't tell. And I had no idea what that was. I was not, I had not fully
Wow.
accepted who I was. Like, I knew that I had these sexual fantasies, these ideas of who I was, but I also thought I could just put it in a box and put it away. And that's the way that I was raised, was, this is a choice, and it's something that you can move beyond. And so really what I think I was trying to do in the Navy was, you know, put the gay stuff away and move on from it. But then I am 19 years old, and I'm unable to, I can't change who I am. I'm like, here I am. It's a funny moment in the memoir where I ran here to get away, and here I am now immersed in the very thing that I'm trying to get away from, which is my attraction to men, and I'm surrounded by the greatest athletes on the planet. In these shower rooms and in the situation, you can't get away from it. I'm totally immersed in it. So I thought I was doing something else, and then really it just showed me who I really was, and that's it. It was a enlightening moment of my youth.
And so you're on a warship and you meet a boyfriend, as one does.
It's a long tradition in the Navy.
But things, I guess, happened. I don't know how much you want to share about this now before the book comes out on October 7th. And for folks who are just tuning in, we are talking with Lance Garland, author whose debut memoir, Out There, Dispatches from My Personal Wilderness, drops on October 7th. You end up being involved in a don't ask, don't tell moment. Do you want to talk about that, or do you feel like this is kind of a spoiler and we should move on to another topic, because you got a lot you're covering here in the memoir?
Well, just to kind of follow up on what you had, asked me earlier, is did I, see this coming? I think a series of events started happening. It's sort of a comedy of errors. I hadn't realized what I had put myself into. And
Mhm.
so then I came out after Navy SEAL training, and then I'm like, oh wait, what is this don't ask, don't tell thing? And it just blindsides me, and I didn't fully understand how that would affect my life and how it would affect my relationship, how it would affect my career. And that's what the middle section of this memoir goes into, is just all of the ways that this law personally negatively affected me and the people around me. And it's very complicated. It's not a simple conversation to have. Like, that's why I wrote a book about it. I mean, my partner was sexually assaulted, and he was silenced and not able to have a voice because of these laws. So yeah, it's a conversation I think I'll continue to have for the foreseeable future. I think that we're dealing with this in our culture right now with the bans on trans service members. So this is incredibly relevant, and
Mhm.
things that people don't totally realize are happening to these trans service people right now, and it's a tragedy. And I hope that by me telling my story and going into those personal, horrible experiences, that it gives, trans service members right now the opportunity to tell their own story, to be heard, and to hopefully be supported by the community at large.
It's I mean, the band, Lavender Scare, back to that, and you have folks like Harvey Milk, who was literally discharged from the military, from the Navy, for being gay, being found out after an investigation by the military. And now, a month ago or this summer, you have the MAGA Trump administration, kick him out again by taking his name off of a ship. And you also have a, defense secretary who's like, repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a mistake, and that should never have happened, and we need to either put it back in or expand our ban of not just trans members but LGBTQ members. So it's you were there enlisted when it was there. Don't Ask, Don't Tell. You got to watch it fall away, and now you've got folks who are leadership who's like, let's bring it back.
Absolutely, yeah.
In the span of 20 years.
Yeah, it's amazing. When I first started writing the drafts of this book, I had agents tell me this is irrelevant. We've all moved on as a culture. Homophobia doesn't exist anymore. Stop crying. And I'm like, I'm not crying. I'm just telling the life that I have lived, and this is ongoing. And what's really interesting, I have to say about the Harvey Milk ship, they took away the name of his ship during Pride Month,
Oh yeah, it
which
was
is an
intentional.
aggressive action, and I view it as an attack on our community. And so these are all attacks on the community. They're ongoing, and so that's why I feel more. Well, I will say it's scary to tell your story in this climate, but I feel more resolved than ever to share this story, because this stuff should not be happening. Americans are all about freedom and the freedom to serve and the freedom to love and all of these things. So I'm saddened by the current culture that is attacking, our own people. It makes no sense to me.
I don't know. I think part of us is Americans are about freedom, and a bunch of us are not. Definitely, I don't know. Definitely not. But so I feel like there's so much that you have in the memoir, and I don't want to be seen as glossing over huge parts of it or your story. But part of it is not just being out. I mean, not being in the military, but after your time after. And you leave and you find a lot of healing within nature. And I have, we're just about 3 minutes before the break, and I know that's a huge topic specific to what you write about and what you do in your life and how you're finding healing. Let's start that conversation around you being in nature and what you were discovering there about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we've talked a lot about the traumas or the horrible obstacles that I've had to face, that we face as a community. And I, like so many people, were trying to start over, build a new life. What do I do? How do I heal? How do I move on?
Mhm.
How do I shoulder the burdens that have been placed on me? And I found that in nature. And it's so funny, you go out into the nature. I started backpacking right when I was about to leave the Navy, and you put your whole life on your backpack, and you go out into the wilderness, and you have to be self-sufficient, and you have to feed yourself, find water, build your own shelter, and sort of be a self-contained individual. And that was the start for me of sifting through all these things that I'd been through and finding, solid ground to walk on, and a belief in myself, in having self-resilience, self-confidence, and just feeling like I had roots. And so, yes, most of this book is I was looking for an answer to, the horrible things that happen to people in life. And I started to find that answer by going out into the wilderness, and then it bloomed from there. And so much of this book is about that. Like, how do we heal? How do we, move past the difficulties of today and into the future and building a better future? And so that's where I found inspiration with all of that darkness was outside.
My guest is Lance Garland, whose debut memoir, Out There, Dispatches from My Personal Wilderness, drops on October 7th. We are including a link in the show notes and on our websites, am950radio.com and heartlandsignal.com, for you to pre-order your own copy. I have to fit in a break here, but we're going to have more with Lance and his memoir when we come back. Be sure to support our sponsors. They make conversations like this possible. Listen to them in the break and let them know that you heard about them on The Gailey Show. Also, sign up for AM950 weekly e-newsletter, where you can find out about all of AM950 shows and more from The Gailey Show. Go to am950radio.com. Scroll down. You find the link there to sign up. You're listening to The Gailey Show. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. We are already coming up on the top of our Friday episode. We're talking with Lance Garland, whose debut memoir, Out There, Dispatches from My Personal Wilderness, drops on October 7th. Lance, when I was listening to you right now talking about getting out into nature, I was reminded of I believe it's a Japanese concept and tradition of forest bathing, where being out in the wilderness, like there's literally like the things that you are inhaling and like being in are very healing to your bodies. Can you talk to us some more about this idea of the experience that you had of being out in nature? Because I think sometimes queer folks are like, oh, maybe I don't, it's safer, quote unquote, to be in urban areas. Like, I don't know what's going to happen to me if I go into, rural areas. So tell us more about the experiences that you were having, what you were discovering about yourself as you're out in the world and backpacking.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting thought, and I had that same thought when I was first going out in the wilderness. I'm like, is it safe to be openly gay out here? Is it safe to be queer? Especially you're driving through these small towns, and oftentimes there's, paraphernalia up that makes you feel not so safe. And so there's this little bit of like, okay, is this cool? Okay, keep it close to home, keep myself safe. But I think that once I hit the trail, I parked that car in that trailhead, and then I hit the trail, and then that forest bathing thing, it begins immediately. You kind of leave civilization behind, the noise of civilization, your phone, you lose service. You start to be removed from, all of the stresses, the pings on your phone, the radio, just, all of the noise of civilization, and you get to feel what it's like to be quiet. And at first that can be unsettling. You're like, oh, okay, quiet. This could be, if I get hurt, I'm going to be in trouble, all this stuff. But then you learn how to do things safely. And, then you get to feel at home in the trees. And then you listen to the wind in the trees and the birds. You start to notice there's all this stuff going on out there too, and then it really centers you in the present moment, which is something that I really needed as a gay person. Is that I was so in my head dealing with all these things that had happened before, thinking about all the fears of the future. Like, what if I'm, not accepted in my next career? What if I can't build a life? There's just so much noise in my head as a gay person that being able to be totally present in the moment was an absolute gift. And that happened by spending hours on trails, and just there's nowhere else to go other than right here, and I'm trying to get to, this peak or the lake or the river or a waterfall or wherever I was going. And that's it. That's what I had that whole day, and to me, it just centered me in a way I had never been. It was a privilege. I had never been given that moment of presence in my life. And so that's how, forest bathing meant everything to me.
You are listening to Lance Garland, who is talking about his new upcoming debut memoir, Out There, Dispatches from My Personal Wilderness. A literary nerd here, so I have to ask, you're talking about putting your life in a backpack and carrying it out with you into the world. Were there any particular books that you were taking with you?
Yeah, actually. So the location that I went to right from the beginning was North Cascades National Park. And what I had been drawn out there by Jack Kerouac, who wrote a book in a fire lookout out on a mountain in the North Cascades. And so at first I started bringing Jack Kerouac books, but then I learned that the whole Beat generation had, a presence there as well. And my favorite poet turned out to be Gary Snyder. And he's, I write about him quite a bit in the book as well. And he would write poetry at these fire lookouts and doing these hikes and bathing in these mountain streams. And I just thought it was like the most beautiful thing ever, and so simple, but yet so like rewarding. So the Beat poets, Philip Whalen was up there too. There's a huge literary tradition in the North Cascades and in nature in general. But they talk about Hanshan, which is a nomad poet from Japan, hundreds of years ago. So it turns out that like being out in the middle of nowhere actually is very, deeply connected to the roots of the literary landscape.
Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of queer folks in Beat. I mean, this is gay men that were in part of the Beat generation, which was things that I mean, Ginsberg, I don't know how I was so upset for so many years that I was like, why didn't anybody in high school or college tell me that Ginsberg was?
I can't believe you didn't know that too. I mean, those are the things about our culture. Sometimes we have to find it and discover it for ourselves. It's not something that we were educated to do. And so much of, Jack Kerouac introduced me to all of those, Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs. And I actually write in the book about Jack Kerouac. He was connected to, another crime that involved, the queer culture at the time in New York, and fascinating story there. And I write about it in relation to my time in Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and how that made me feel and how I could interpret, and empathize with that time period. So yeah, I found some connection in culture, even in the middle of the North Cascades National Park. So.
I knew this was going to be a jam-packed conversation, and I've got 90 seconds, and I haven't even asked you a single question about being a firefighter. So I guess I would say thank you for your service as a firefighter. Briefly, are you going to be doing any tour events, public readings about your book this fall?
So far, I have readings booked in Washington State, Bainbridge Island, Seattle, Bellingham. And I'm starting to branch out and try to reach out. I might be going to Banff. I might be going to Texas. And so we're trying to put that together now. So if somebody listening wants a guest, reach out. I am available for readings and conversations.
And they can do so, I imagine, through your website, lancegarland.com. Also, you are, actually, he is out there with Lance on, Out There with Lance on Instagram, correct? Is your handle?
Out There with Lance, yep.
Okay. In my notes, I was like, okay. Anyway, thank you, Lance, for joining me here today. And thank you, everyone, for listening and or watching on YouTube. We're going to see you all back here on Monday. Until then, have a great weekend and keep it queer, America.